Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. And on today's episode, we're going to... so I've got some stuff recorded with a CA of One Armoured on sort of experimentation and talking about using sort of machine learning in command posts and some exercising emissions control and some jamming. And then subsequently, I've got another episode coming up on sort of more complex communication stuff with, again, jamming and then machine learning in command posts, specific to comms. Before we do that, though, I definitely need a refresher on basic communications, and I think it will be helpful for us to talk through. It's something you cannot have enough of, and that's basically the episode today is based in tactical communications, what we use to send information and talk to one another inside a brigade specifically. So from a sensor, so recon screen up as far as you can go, all the way back to a brigade headquarters, and sort of how we pass information. My guest today is a signals officer, CAPT Jack Virtue. He served a number of appointments in brigades, probably more than most, a good sort of breadth of experience, and then subsequently went on to some strategic comm stuff. Welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah. Let's talk before we get into tactical communications and what goes right and wrong with the options that we have available. Can you just go through your sort of posting history and more so the experiences that you've had so far throughout your time in a brigade and then subsequently post brigade headquarters, brigade time?
Yeah. So I've probably had a very unusual start to my career compared to most signals officers. I posted straight out of RMC to Kapooka as a non-qual platoon commander before going on ROBC in the latter half of 2018. Subsequently went to 1 Brigade in Darwin. I went to 1 CSR as a troop commander before posting to 1 CER as the regimental signals officer for 1 year in 2020. And then 21-22, I spent time at 812 as their regimental signals officer. Since then, posted back to Canberra, and I went to number 1 Joint Data Networks Unit, which is, I guess, more at the operational and pushing into the strategic level, predominantly working with RAF, Navy, and limited, I guess, with Army, but moving into that space a bit more.
So, and I suppose you've seen signal. You've been to a unit that you've seen only signals hat badges, basically, and you've worked with signals officers and soldiers. Then subsequently, you went to engineers. So you've done communications for like tactical tasks like breaches and construction and plant equipment and the like, a plethora of different stuff. You did touch, and you didn't mention it, but you have done a little bit in the aviation space with One Aven, and then subsequently you've been to 812, which is the artillery regiment up in Darwin. So you've done artillery comms as well. So it touched like a number of different things, and then gone into strategic comms, I suppose. Does that summarise your experience?
Yeah, and I think the biggest difference between all those roles that I've noticed, some, I guess, corps, obviously SIGs, we're full of signallers, easy, but some corps have dedicated trades that work on their communications, particularly at the tactical level, and then others don't. They just re-roll, for example, combat engineers just re-roll non-qualified personnel into their signals platoon. So I guess the quality of what you're getting between the corps and the regiment varies, and that really affects how you plan communications and how much you can rely on other people to achieve the comms plan and, I guess, making it work on the ground.
Yeah, because I think like signallers, like you would like to, that's their bread and butter, right? It's every day they're doing, and maybe not radios, but like data links and the like. Yeah. That's their day job. With engineers, they have a day job, which is EOD, might be, combat engineers inside the squadrons and stuff, or they're in the construction squadrons. Like that, their job, they have a day job and their communications come second. That's predominantly my experience, is the fact that comms is often an afterthought because we have day jobs and we're sort of constantly, we've got a tactical task or we have a task to achieve our field. So comms can come and I think we do that in training as well. We sometimes ignore the communications restrictions on a manoeuvre plan in training to be able to run the manoeuvre plan. But basically, like, I think the things that I've seen in my experience, having people who are sort of not comms specific soldiers, is like, I remember being in the field and patrol was just about to step off, and they were in B vehicles. And I remember I was in the company command post, and I couldn't get comms with the lead call sign at all. Like we just couldn't get comms with the SECO that was going out on this patrol. And I went down there to physically find this communication set up on this B vehicle. And I remember standing in front of the vehicle, and this will make heaps of sense to most people because like they'll be like, this is the answer, this is what's wrong. But to me at the time, it took me a little bit longer. But I still remember going up to the vehicle, and the radio is in the cradle. The cradle has power. The amplifier on the back of the cradle is turned on, and it seems to be working. I could get comms from 2 meters in front of the vehicle with a handheld on a whip, but you move it 50 meters out, and I couldn't get comms, and I couldn't work out what was going on. It suffice to say, it took me a little bit longer than most to work out what was going on. But then all I did was look up to the top of the vehicle, and there's an antenna mount there with no antenna on it. So incredibly difficult to transmit without an antenna. And I just remember thinking like, this is it. It's so comms help so much with targeting, knowing where the enemy is. If you get geographically embarrassed, you can find your way back with comms. Like it is pivotal to what we do, but sometimes we don't prioritize as much as we should. And I think this episode sets the preconditions for that, I suppose.
Yeah, obviously there's examples of that occur on the daily. And I think it just, comes back to how often are we also prioritizing, as you said, communications training, doing reps and sets for the warfighters out there on those, I guess, skill sets that enable us to, set up a whole vehicle, put the radios in the rack, make sure the antenna's on the roof, those little things. It's like using a rifle. If you don't do your training on a regular basis, you're going to forget the little skills that make you or help you operate that rifle to the best of your ability and to the weapon system's capability.
And then it goes back to that. So from an artillery perspective, the command posts like exercises are frequent. Like they're constantly testing comms and like making sure they're all over it. And that is a big part of artillery, like preparation for battle, I suppose. Not so much in, other trades or sort of course specific stuff because you're focusing on that day job. So if we come back to the stuff we can't see, which is the options available to people inside tactical communications, can you just, before we launch into some meaty stuff, can you just talk about what options are available inside a brigade headquarters for tactical communications?
Yeah, so I guess you can break it down into two categories. You got your line of sight capabilities, and then you have beyond line of sight. Line of sight being VHF, UHF, point to point, and then you'll be on line of sight looking more at your HF and then satellite communications.
And that's sort of the four main options. To make it simple, like they are the four main options of waveforms that are available.
Yeah, at a basic level.
Yeah.
They're the four that enable, I guess, the section commander at the front of the front line to communicate information, data, surveillance, anything like that, back through the battle group headquarters all the way up to the commander, being the brigade commander. And then from there, we use different systems to, I guess, push it higher outside of the formation. Yeah,
so from one brigade to one div, for example, that would be a different link of a type of communications, I suppose. But we're just going to talk about what's used inside the brigade to get information to the brigade headquarters, I suppose, ultimately to, enable the command to take, advantage of shock or surprise and to take tactical actions. You touched on a point there between data and voice. In the close air support episode I did with OC of JTAC troop and a backseater in a Super Hornet, they were talking about how much easier it is to send target data through ATAC, like a sort of, it's a flip down tablet or phone on the front of their body armor, the JTAC, that can plot target data and send it to the aircraft. Is that so? What advantages or disadvantages come from using data and voice? And I imagine you have to still use a combination of both. How does that the interplay between data and voice work at a brigade headquarters level? Yeah, so
voice is more, I guess, time sensitive. However, it raises the noise, like the transmission noise. Easier to target. Think about it. You're holding the pressel switch down. You've probably been talking for too long.
And then you get like a say again all after, so the transmission gets even longer sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess if I contrast that to data, data is sent in packets, but it also allows you to send, so lower noise signature, but it also allows you to send things like text files, pictures, imagery, whatever it might be, that I guess the old adage, like a picture tells 1,000 words, it provides a lot more information with
a single transmission.
Yeah. And lower signature, like detection threshold signature, compared to voice where, again, you're holding the Pressel switch and it's just blaring out until you take your finger off the Pressel switch. So.
Yeah. And I think you talked before about the difference between line of sight and beyond line of sight. That being, so I think most people will have used ultra high frequency or very high frequency communication in the past. Line of sight, that would be common for most people inside a training area to have used those different waveforms and sort of understand how that works going from one person to another across the ground. So line of sight. The beyond line of sight options, that being SATCOM or satellite communications and high frequency comms, there's a dark art to that, isn't there? Just before we get into the reliability of each waveform, HF is difficult to use. So we talked about operator error before, and then overlay that onto a more technical type of communications. Like HF is difficult to use.
Yeah, that is absolutely a fair assumption. We definitely we do use it. We do not train it enough, in my experience, because it is hard to train. And we usually fall back to things like, or I guess ease of use being, VHF, UHF, SATCOM, because it takes less to set up and get right. And obviously when we're in the field, the commander wants comms. Well, I'm going to go, there's a tendency to go to the easiest option to get him comms. That way he's not chewing me out.
You have a big pace plan, like primary, alternate, contingency, and then emergency, and you just go straight for emergency, which is just like SATCOM. Do you know what I mean? I've seen that so many times. You know what I mean? We just go immediately to the E in pace plan.
Yeah, and that's because it's easy to set up and it's there. And while we're using that, we can then fault find the other stuff and set that up in the background. And that way, eventually, we will get to a point where we have the pace in full.
Yeah.
Whether that's VHF, HF, SATCOM, and then satellite phone or something as the emergency, we'll usually, get what we can and then go into engineering to, I guess, fix or fault find the ones that aren't working until we get the full pace plan.
Interesting that you put aren't working in there, because my next question is the reliability of both. It's sort of all of the waveforms. What sort of, can you walk us through how reliable each of the waveforms is in terms of like, getting comms within a brigade headquarters?
Yeah, so using VHF, UHF, very reliable when you have line of sight, hence why they're in the line of sight category. When you're in, I guess, not heavy vegetation, the weather is fine. Once you start to overlay that with, now I'm in heavy foliage, there's trees, there's leaves, there's branches, everything in the way. You've got mountainous terrain. Now there's a big mountain in the way. How is my line of sight? I now don't have it. So then we go to HF or satellite communications. And then that's where we experience the issues, I guess, with not having trained or, as you said, HF being a bit of a dark art. Well, now I've got a fault find from the physical, the radio in the rack, make sure all the cables all the way through to the antenna are all serviceable. Then we look at the software inside the radio or the laptop interface, make sure all those settings are correct. And then on top of that, then we add crypto, which there's settings and parameters that need to be correct with that as well. So it adds a whole heap of complexity in trying to establish those comms. And less so, but same for SATCOM as well. There's intricacies with antennas, the crypto. It's the same.
Yeah, I think that SATCOM analogy is I still remember. So this is the confusing or the difference between line of sight and beyond line of sight. Like I still remember, I was at Scale A at at Mount Bundy training area up in Darwin, and the headquarters of this battle group or battalion was in Howard Springs back in Darwin. So it was definitely too far for line of sight communications back to Mount Bundy. It's an hour and a half drive or something to get to that point. And I still remember one of the call signs jumped out of their vehicle and sort of was unable to establish comms back to their headquarters node. And I said, "What waveform are you using?" And they were like, "Oh, it's SATCOM. I'm using satellite communications, I think." And I was like, "Okay, cool." So the guy he's got a handheld in one hand and a Coke can antenna, which is the satellite communications dismounted antenna, in the other. And he's trying to establish comms by pointing the satellite communications antenna at the headquarters location, so on a bearing, effectively. I think it was way looser than a bearing, but like in the right direction. And I just think this sums up the sort of some of the intricacies of the theory behind communications that we don't understand, which is that like the antenna needs to be pointed at the satellite, not at the call sign you're trying to.
Todd, you keep coming up with these really specific vignettes of things that people have done. I'm starting to think it's you.
Yeah. Okay, it's me. But like, so can you just explain how that it doesn't work? Do you know what I mean? Like satellite communications pointing back at a comms node, back at Howard Springs, is not how satellite communications work.
Yeah. So the antenna needs to be set up to point at the satellite, and then the satellite has a beam that obviously covers an area of the globe that would encompass the Howard Springs node, and then it would send it back down on a separate frequency down to the receiver. Yeah.
And so we talked about reliability of waveforms. So UHF and VHF, I just want to talk about that. Obviously, line of sight, far more reliable, but you said there's always a trade-off. So yes, UHF is reliable. However, it doesn't have the range that, that's the trade-off, right? You can't get further in your communications. VHF further, but then slightly more technically to use, I suppose. If we talk about, so high-frequency communications, outside of how difficult it may be to use if you haven't used it a lot of times, can we talk about satellites and the reliability of SATCOM? Because that tends to come up as an issue in most comms planning, is that satellite communications can be incredibly reliable but can be denied by, the enemy or anything like that.
Yeah, satellite communications is very, susceptible to jamming or spoofing, anything like that. I guess the other consideration for satellite communications is less so enemy focused, more tactical planning. Often in the brigade, and I assume this would change if we were in a conflict, but often in the brigade you don't get the, satellite resource. So the connection is broken down to be shared between everyone because we only have a finite amount of it. And therefore what I've found is you'll get given a satellite channel, you'll be given the frequencies for you to use, all that, but you might be sharing that same channel with another call sign. So one exercise I was on, we were out in Mount Bundy training area. We had a 5K dedicated SAT channel afforded to us, which was awesome. But we kept getting interference because what I found out was actually 7 Brigade over in Brisbane was also using that same channel. The only reason we couldn't hear them is we're on separate crypto. Little things like that also make reliability, in the brigade and particularly exercising, very difficult. Yeah, and I guess because it's a finite resource.
Yeah, the finite resource thing, like you only have so much bandwidth. So that's SATCOM and high frequency, the reliability of all of it. And then you talked about trade-offs. You touched on it in briefly just in your previous answer, but what impact does the environment have on it? And do you have tools to be able to work out, roughly what the impact the environment and stuff is going to have?
Yeah, so there's a number of, we have, defense tools as well, but there's also a number of open source tools that allow you to essentially pick 2 points and work out whether it's for line of sight, whether what the terrain in between those 2 points would look like, and how that would affect, the propagation. For example, if we're on two sides of Bougainville and you wanted to talk line of sight across, there's obviously a massive mountain range in the middle of the island. So that's going to come up and show you, hey, this probably isn't going to work. There are times where you use those tools and it may show you, hey, this will work. There's nothing in the line of sight. There's no mountain range, whatever it might be, but you'll still get on the ground and it won't work. And I guess that's the difficult part, and often why when commanders are like, well, why don't I have communications? It's about the understanding of, because you can't see it, it's not as simple as, say, as a tank throwing a track, right? You know why the tank now can't move. With comms, you don't, because you can't see it, it's much harder to fault find, and obviously that increases the time that you need to take to fault find. And I sort of touched on it before, but you need to work from the physical layer, like the radio in the rack, all the way through to the antenna where it's transmitting or receiving.
And then it becomes like you can't see the rest of it effectively. So you're sort of fault finding on things you can't see, which is far more difficult.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I guess, parameters in that. Again, the tank track example, it's a tank track. You can see it. I need to replace it or put it back on. With, I guess, the software side, for example, it could be one number off, and that is the reason that parameter is now not allowing you to get communications. It's as simple as that, but it's very difficult to fault find. And I guess that's why it takes so long sometimes.
Yeah. So, and if we talk about, we've got tools and how difficult it is to fault find. If we go to so a lot of our exercises and any planning serials we've been through are in like Townsville field training area. There are parts in there where it is somewhat mountainous and different altitudes, I suppose, and also different levels of sort of vegetation density. But I think the thing we're talking about with the potential operating environment is sort of to our north, I suppose, is really condensed vegetation, and also incredibly, you touched on it before, but altitude having an impact. What sort of things, like just in that potential operating environment, can affect the communications that we use and make it more important to use different waveforms, I suppose?
Yeah, I guess the big factor, I already touched on it, being the terrain. So obviously if there's something in the way that you can't move, that's going to affect your line of sight and force you to go to beyond line of sight means. I guess distance is the other thing. We've had conversations recently about the introduction into service of the new landing craft and amphibious vehicles that Army's getting. Understanding the distances that those, I guess, systems are going to operate at, from whether it's Australia or to other call signs in a battle space, really affects on what systems you can use. General planning on a good day for VHF, right, is 8 kilometres, give or take. Obviously, if the ships, for example, or landing craft are operating outside of that 8 kilometres, you need to then, look at, well, what's my next option? Hey, is it HF? Is it SATCOM? And the last one being, last big one, I guess, being weather. Depending on what systems you're using, the weather can have a significant effect on how you are transmitting. For example, different weather patterns or night and day really affect HF communications. So you need to, within HF communications, the difference between operating between night and day is different frequencies.
Adds to the complexity of how difficult it is to use, I suppose.
Yeah, immensely. Whereas VHF, you're using one frequency or frequency hopping, but it's a single frequency at one point in time transmitting or receiving.
That makes sense. So yeah, distance, and then obviously terrain will have an impact, like rock gets in the way of line of sight communications, vegetation as well, like you've spoken about. How dense terrain will not enable you to get line of sight communication. You talked about jamming before, and I don't want to go into too much sort of detail because we'll have a whole episode on that and machine learning in command post. But can you just talk about sort of what jamming is and how the enemy can have an impact on our communications?
Yeah, so jamming essentially just denying the enemy or the enemy denying us communications. Methods of doing that vary between the tactical and strategic levels, but in essence, that's as simple as it gets, like using with a means, denying comms to an adversary or, again, vice versa.
And I suppose it's not as simple as just sort of overpowering another a frequency, or and then avoiding it with frequency hopping or something like that. There's more like when you admit the power that it takes to be able to tactically jam someone, like it raises your noise floor, to use your sort of terminology before. It's sort of like it comes at great risk when people jam. It's not so much that you just like all your screens go blank and then you don't get to see anything. That's not how it works, is it?
No. And I think you've had a guest presenter on here before who's touched on it as well. But essentially, if you jam a frequency or a range of frequencies for a period of time, your power output will increase. Again, your thermal signature, your EMS signature, all these will increase, and that again makes you detectable. So it's, I guess, a double-edged sword, similar to, I guess, counter battery fire for an artillery reference. Once the guns fire, you are moving and changing locations to deny the enemy from effectively conducting counter battery fire on your position.
So you used an analogy of counter battery fire, but like that's exactly right. They're going to try and, I suppose, the enemy or us will try and target that jamming node that we now has increased its noise floor, and we can identify range, distance, and a location. We then inherently would target it with offensive support to be able to destroy that element. It doesn't seem. I think we ignore that component, the second order effect, which is the double-edged sword.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, it's not just like you touched on it before, your screen just doesn't go black. You still, like in a CP, if you're getting jammed, you're still going to see the map data that was on the screen. You're just not going to get live updates while you're being jammed. And it's very rudimentary, right? But you've asked me this question before, and yeah, there's a number of things to it, and I think we don't necessarily train it well because it's a very complex concept to a lot of people.
And again, not seen, like you can't see it.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's fair. So that sums up, I suppose, we've gone through different waveforms, which is line of sight and beyond line of sight. That being line of sight, ultra high frequency and very high frequency communications. Subsequently, beyond line of sight being SATCOM and high frequency. They're the waveforms available to a formation from sensor all the way through to brigade headquarters. You've worked with, and you've both seen radio operators with RA6 hat badges, but also artillery systems operators and different hat badges prioritising different components of their comms training. Where do you think we should be spending the time training before we, I suppose, start as early as you can is an obvious one, but like where do you think we start with the training and getting after the comm stuff?
I think I've already briefly touched on it while we've been talking, but the main thing is early in the year, CPXing. This allows a number of things because once the year gets going, it becomes too busy to do a CPX. Just like I mentioned before, using your CNR or your combat net radio skills are just as important as your rifle drills. If you don't use them, you will lose them. And doing CPXs at the start of the year is a good refresher for everyone before the busy year kicks off. And
I think so in Darwin, if we use our experience, the training areas are closed until a fair way into the year anyway. So an amazing opportunity is to do CPXing on base, first testing the physical components of the radio, but then subsequently actually using the equipment to try to establish communications across barracks or sending nodes out to try and increase the range to make it more difficult, I suppose. Is that a good way to go about it?
Yeah, and even on top of that, you're identifying people who aren't up to the standard that is required. So I guess from a training perspective, like individual training, it allows you to identify people who may still need to go on other courses. For example, BCCC, SCCC, making sure they have those qualifications so that when they do get there, they have some level of knowledge in using the equipment, so that when you do go on CPX, you aren't just stuffing around, not sure really what's going on. You have the unit has a plan, how we're going to do it, what we're testing, what are we, making sure all the equipment works, not just on base, but as you sort of mentioned there, like going further and further away to maybe non-defense training areas or close training areas, so that not everyone is within line of sight, and you're testing those more complex, I guess, means of communication, and everyone's not relying on, I'll just flick back to VHF because I know that's going to work.
Or flick to SATCOM because it's a more sort of reliable communication form. Get people out shaking out the kit and making sure that they can actually use everything they've got.
Yeah.
All right, so that's, I suppose, the individual stuff. We talk about training, CPXing often, and getting getting into doing it with the resources you have. You know what I mean? You don't need a massive training area to do CPXing, and you can get after that without, I suppose it's sort of low impost, because other than the S6 and the comms team at your unit to get all the crypto in the radios and get everything set up. So I won't be flippant and say there's no work involved. It's far easier to do. You don't have to book a range or anything like that. You can just get out and CPX. And you've seen it a number of times. You successfully done. And how do people successfully CPX?
I guess the biggest thing to start with would be making sure the equipment works. Getting all your radios, antennas, racks, whatever it might be, go through, checking the serviceability. That is like ground
bare
zero.
Bones,
bare bones, ground zero. Then stepping through, like putting it all together as if you were going to use it, making sure that, I've got the right crypto in there. I've set the parameters within the radio to what I need it to do for the comms plan. Then stepping through, putting it into the vehicles, or how you're actually going to operate it in the field before stepping off anywhere. And then I guess the fourth part would be, once you're happy that all the equipment's serviceable, you got all your parameters in there correctly, and you've set it up properly on the vehicle or in the CP, whatever configuration that you are chasing, then you step out into that field environment, add the complexities of environment and time of the year.
Range, all those sort of
range,
things.
distances.
Yeah. I suppose CPX, with the safety of technical stuff, you have boffins there to help you make sure that power is correct. You have radio operators there to make sure that you're doing the right thing with the radios, so that you can step out into a training area without that support and do some fault finding, and it should work. You know what I mean? That's the goal.
Should being the operative word.
Yeah.
This goes without saying. Test everything in barracks in an environment where you have the support systems, the right people in place and easily accessible, to ensure that when you step out into the field and you don't have that safety net of, I'll just duck back and grab that antenna, you are 100% sure that everything is as it should be. And again, the operative word being should, as should work.
In accordance with the comms plan. Before we go into, so that's a lot on the individual skills. So do more courses, CPX far more often. You can do that from any headquarters down. I suppose if we zoom out a touch, and just before I go into some subsequent episodes with sort of about experimentation in the comm space, and then subsequently jamming and machine learning, before we do that, can you just define for us, and this is a hard question, right? I'm hitting you with a hard one right at the end, but can you just define the current comms challenge with operating communications in our potential operating environment, noting we talked about, dense terrain and all that, like the island chain to our north. Can you just define the problem? How hard is it, what we're currently being asked to do?
I think it's extremely complex. And I think if I tried to define it, and again, if I caveat this by saying I'm not an SME, that means I absolve any responsibility of my answer. But I think the biggest complexity are going to be around how disaggregated we will be if we were to say a scenario to our north on an island chain. And that disaggregation overlaid with a mix of various platforms, levels of training, equipment, you overlay all that together, and I think it is going to be an extremely difficult problem to solve. And I am unsure how long that problem, I guess, is going to take to be solved.
Because we're sort of overlaying. So now we're infilling with landing craft, which adds a maritime component. Even just at a physical component, I imagine the radios can or cannot operate in salt water, and then subsequently we overlay, everyone wants close air support in support of their operations. So we're talking to aircraft now. So that complexity is something that probably we don't test that much in the field, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and obviously when we're just doing Army exercises, we are focusing on, I guess, just Army, and maybe we have some enablers there in a limited capacity. I guess one thing that I took from my previous posting at one JDNU, even I guess RAF and Navy, who have been doing, and it's kind of their bread and butter to operate together, there's still complexities between even their systems that they've had for 10, 20, 30 years. And there's still little intricacies that will, I guess, undo a plan just down to the minute 1 or 0. And now, as you said, we're an army that is now trying to incorporate aircraft, naval platforms, landing craft to develop our littoral maneuver capability. And that's not even touching already the things that we've discussed, being lack of training, lack of resourcing, not enough time to train to get to a standard, the weather, climate, the weather, all the things that will affect communications when we do land on that beach, to go and secure an airfield, to set the conditions for a brigade or formation maneuver plan.
That's absolutely awesome. I think we've touched on everything there, and it's been a good teaser for the subsequent episodes, which will go into a bit more complexity. But that is, I suppose, tactical communications. So we've got line of sight communications and beyond line of sight being VHF and UHF, and then beyond line of sight being SATCOM and HF. How it's always a trade-off between the complexities of using the type of waveform that you're going to use versus how reliable the communications are as well. So that usability versus reliability. That was absolutely awesome and sets us up really well for the next episode. Thanks for coming on, Jack.
Thanks, Todd. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.